can that game actually reach its full potential? These are the deep, hard-hitting questions that we get challenged with every day. I feel like that was going to get more philosophical, and then I lost it halfway through. But it's also the questions that we're going to try to address in the panel tonight for sure, and a little bit in with the panelists that we have coming today for the interviews. And I wanted to interview all the panelists separately from the panels, which is why we're doing these podcast interviews partially, because the panels are a chance to talk around a theme, to talk around a specific kind of concept or idea that hits people a certain way. But the actual interviews is a chance to kind of really see the nitty gritty of how these experts or how these highly experienced individuals are able to kind of relate to the material on hand. And so we have some really interesting speakers, some of which, I mean, almost everyone coming to the event as like a panelist or a speaker, I did not actually know prior to organizing the event. Like I maybe have stumbled across some of their work, or I'd heard of their company, but I had not personally like met them, shook their hands, said hi to them, given them a wave or anything like that. And so it's been actually really interesting to get a chance to jump in and kind of see the different work that people are doing, to kind of hear about the different things that people are doing, kind of learn from that and grow from that. And so we are waiting for a panelist to come. I have a feeling that we're not going to have our first panelist today because there was a family problem that came up. And I think, family's more important than a interview for a panel that they'll be on later. So we'll probably just be sitting tight until about just after 2 when Diogo Henriques joins us for our conversation. I mean, I'll introduce Diogo then, but they're an academic who studies in and around educational games, typically in the space of human and computer interaction, or HCI. For anyone unfamiliar, that's kind of a discipline that focuses a lot more on kind of like the design and systems side and computational side of fields and research. So for example, I'll be actually in the summer talking alongside Diogo on a panel in Copenhagen, and the panel is on educational games, and I'll be talking a lot about the value of analog games. And I remember pitching it to them, and they were like, well, it's human and computer. And I was like, yeah, but we're talking about like computer issues in analog games. And so it's a space where typically a lot of the research doesn't involve human subjects. It's much more like looking at like systems, the design of the systems, the structures of the systems, than how the systems can and are engaged with. There obviously is like quantitative and qualitative work that can be done in both these spaces, but it'll be interesting to kind of see what they're doing. Marissa's dropping a question here, so thank you, Marissa. I think I remember you from yesterday, Marissa, so thank you for tuning in. I really appreciate it. I hope that the event so far has been helpful for you. I'm just going to read your question out in case people are listening in later when I kind of put this into the podcast. But what are some resources for people who wish to explore game design or deepen or exhibit their students' knowledge, analog and or digital? So I think that's like a 2-part question, because you're asking first off, like, what are some resources for people who wish to kind of get into the design side? And then how do we kind of deepen student knowledge? And so if you're someone who's interested in design, first off, depending on if you want to design board games, if you want to design digital games, there are a ton of resources out there. If you're like a complete, like, I know nothing, and you want to design like a video game, I mean, you can do the thing of, I'm going to learn Unity, which is a very common engine that these companies use. But that's going to probably be really hard if you don't have anyone to support you. So a lot of the time people would recommend typically softwares that are easier to kind of get in at the entry level. So if you were listening yesterday, we talked about Bitsy with Vanessa. And Bitsy is kind of a 8-bit style program. You can probably Google it and it will come up, and you can do it in your browser. It's very simple, and the coding is very minimal. Like, you don't have to have an extensive understanding of computer language and computer code to be able to kind of work on Bitsy. Twine is another example if you're really into like narrative adventure games and storytelling. Twine is a tool that you can probably pick up in a weekend, and it will be pretty good for you. Like, you can make something pretty quickly. I'm actually doing my dissertation research in Twine in some capacity. like I am doing my journaling in that software because it's a really nice way to kind of do like a branching system. So if you're trying to learn the basics of game design, starting with like very simple softwares can be a way to do it. But also like there are videos online that can help you do that. If you're interested in kind of more getting that knowledge and you're not like a great learner from like YouTube videos yourself, as someone who's like gotten into tabletop and analog game design, there are like mentorship programs that exist, some of which are free. There's literally one called Tabletop Mentorship Program, where they'll partner you with someone in the industry as long as you have a game idea. It doesn't even have to be like made or like, it just has to be an idea. Like I pitched an idea for a game to it that I had nothing actually designed or mocked up for, and someone was like, that sounds cool, I'll work with this person to try to make an idea for it. And so whatever stage you're in, you can find people to help kind of mentor you in that process. If you're a student, or if like you're like in a university space, most universities now have some form of a games lab. I say most, I feel like most large universities will say that. Some of the small universities, especially in the States, you might not have a games program, but they're definitely becoming more popular or more common, which is nice. And then also, so I got distracted because someone came in here and they have the name Scott DeYoung, which is my name, which means I got confused as to who that person is. So if you could change your name, unless your name is Scott DeYoung, that'd be great, just so I know who you are. That's a side note. So in terms of the second part of your question, Marissa, where you're asking how do we kind of deepen or exhibit students' knowledge, I think that's actually a space in the literature that there isn't a ton being written on. So when we're talking about like, how do we actually get students to effectively engage with games, to learn, a lot of the literature is like, I made a game, I asked students before the game how they felt about X concept. They then played the game and then I quizzed them after about X concept. Guess what? They learned more. And that doesn't actually tell us about how they go about kind of gaining understanding from that process. And so one of the things that I've been looking at is, instead of focusing on games, I'm focusing on play, which I know sounds like a really silly distinction. And in academia, sometimes we have to do those silly distinctions. But the idea is that instead of focusing on what they're playing, I'm focusing on how they're playing and what they're doing and how they're engaging with the system. And to do that, I'm partially doing things myself and doing autoethnographic work, which is where I play through games and I analyze them myself, which is what I was doing a bit earlier today with some other people. But I'm also looking at kind of like gameplay logs. You can look at forums, or you can actually interview the players themselves. And that's going to be the latter portion of my work, where I'll be interviewing people in their play, in the things that they're doing. But from a more formal structure for teachers, I think it's important to think about where you're trying to engage students in the process. So game design is actually a really powerful space for learning, where if you're just having students talk about the basics of what they're trying to put together, all of a sudden they're taking concepts and they're having to boil it down into something that's mechanical and something that's playable. So what I mean by that is, like, the basics of game design, we have our rules, we have our narratives, we have some world building, we have some mechanics. And you don't have to be an expert game designer to kind of think through like some of those basics, right? So you can start with a story, perhaps. You can start with a really like fun idea you have. Like maybe, for example, with the games that are here, like someone had an idea of like, I want to talk about how cells protect themselves from bacteria, right? And so they don't need like anything beyond like, that's what I want to do. And then you talk about, well, if they're protecting themselves, then there has to be someone attacking. And so from there, you talk about like, well, who's attacking? And then you have to think about the bacteria. And then you have to go, how are they attacking? And so maybe some bacteria move really quickly. Maybe some other bacteria move in like clumps. Maybe some don't actually attack, but they try to sneak inside. And so all of a sudden you have, you know, speed, clumps, sneaking. Those are kind of things that you can think about as mechanics and what that can look like. And you can build from there. And so from a design space, you're taking a very simple idea and you're boiling it down into actual procedures, actual steps, and actual processes that can be put into the final game, which can be a space for learning. But additionally, if we're wanting to engage students in their kind of knowledge around the material, you can also not just have them play games, but have them talk about their play, have them share their play stories, have them break down what they're doing. I don't know if anyone tuned in earlier to when we were kind of live streaming some game analysis, but there were moments in there where I had some people from the fourth space who I don't know if they would consider themselves expert game analyses people, but they might not have had much experience with it. But we were going through kind of the steps of like, okay, first things first, what does the game look like? What does the interface look like? What does the screen tell me? What do the cards tell me? What does it look like when it's set up? Asking that question immediately opens up space for kind of breaking down, is there learning in that specific moment, right? And then you get into, okay, well, what do you do, right? So in one of the games, we're making headlines. So we're taking cards and we're putting them on the table in a certain order, right? Why are we putting in that order? Is there a reason for that? Is there not a reason for that, and why? Having them kind of wrestle with those questions makes them think, okay, well, I wanted, you know, like a really clickbaity word at the front, and so I wanted like a very like emotionally heavy word at the front of my sentence, or I didn't want a lot of filler words because they make the sentence go long, and then all of a sudden, in that process of breaking down what they did in the game, even if they weren't aware of it at the time, they're engaging in the learning concepts at hand. So to kind of summarize my answer to your question, as simply as I can, if you're interested in doing game design, I would suggest kind of looking at some of the grassroots places where things are being done. So game jams, some very simple kind of softwares like Twine or Bitsy that can help you kind of put those things together. And if you're kind of looking for resources to help students deepen their thinking and knowledge, I would recommend kind of inviting them to be part of that process of being the resources themselves. Like when we're playing games, we are the ones that are putting our knowledge into it. And so having them kind of break that out themselves. But if you are looking for more formal things, there are individuals that do kind of break down games for you. Like you can find like game reviews, like Common Sense Media does a lot of stuff on educational games for kids in the States, that you could kind of use as a jumping off point for yourself as a teacher if you're not quite sure how to break down the game yourself. So I hope that's helpful. There's so much more to that question. I don't know where you live either, but like in Montreal, if you are interested yourself in game design, there's a group called Gamerella and a group called Pixels, which tries to help young devs, especially young devs who are not the typical white males that we see in the industry, kind of get a foot into kind of making games and seeing how they can use them. And you don't have to have any experience to participate in those spaces. Like they expect people to show up to the workshops with not even understanding of what code looks like. And they're really wonderful, wonderful spaces. But I have seen that our first kind of interviewee has entered the conversation for today for the podcast, which is Diogo Henriques. And if I'm saying your name wrong, please correct me when you unmute your mic, if you can unmute your mic. So the first question that I ask every single person that I ever interview is, can you please introduce yourself for anyone who ends up listening to this interview in the future?
Yes. So my name is Diogo Henriques. I'm originally Portuguese, but for the past 20 years, I have been living in several countries in Europe and Asia. And I have been working in universities, mostly in research, sometimes also bridging with teaching. And I'm currently based in Denmark, in Aarhus, at the Department of Media and Journalism within the Faculty of Arts. I'm a multidisciplinary, also multilingual. And in these several disciplines where I have met people and I have worked with, one is also game design.
Awesome. I love that. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your time. So since you are someone who works more in the academic space, or at least has current experience in the academic space, and this is a conversation that I want people in the non-academic space to be able to listen to and not be super confused with all the terms and theories that we start throwing around, yes. Could you, for a general audience, explain how your work relates to education and games?
Yes. So I found a group that was somehow organized by Daniel Riha from Prague University, that was doing these conferences called cyber cultures. They were based in Oxford, but with people all over the world. And they went to do one of these conferences in Lisbon. And I found the topic super interesting, and it allowed me to do a presentation that in academic terms we call present a paper. So do a short presentation at the conference about digital topics in architecture that were more easily discussed and talked with communities of game design than in architecture, that is traditionally a much more how to say, conservative, sometimes even old discipline. So I started meeting people with this group, and it was a good space to test ideas and to discuss things that with people from architecture I could not do. Things related with cyberspace, digital spaces, virtual reality, So that's where my work started somehow touching also game design. And in the last 2 or 3 years, I have been also doing presentations and making some kind of research or study of how game design can be used in education spaces. So, for example, last year it was particularly focused on Minecraft, how Minecraft was used in during the pandemic as a substitute of the campus and the educational spaces that were closed due to the lockdowns. And this year is more related with startups and how students can be informed about different ways and different economies, can be in game design or in others, to develop their own futures that are not so corporate or so destructive for the environment as the big companies.
That's really cool. I mean, there's a lot there. So I'm I kind of want to start with the Minecraft piece because I think it's something that in the first day here, and in my conversations, people kind of kept bringing up Minecraft like as an educational game, and they're like, "Well, is it?" And I'm like, "I mean, I think it can be considered an educational game," but they're like, "Well, but it's a commercial game." And so, for you, who's
Yes.
doing things with Minecraft that you're considering educational, where do you see that line of Minecraft as an educational versus a commercial game? Is it in the game itself? Is it in how we're using the game? How does that kind of become an educational piece?
Um, yeah, so obviously things are not black and white, right? So there's always a lot of different tones. So yes, it's a commercial and successful commercial Minecraft. But I saw really an educational aspect when it was so there was this case in several universities, but one that was really striking was in Stanford, that the students has a way to cope with the pandemic and feeling isolated. They started building the campus on Minecraft, so they use it as a way to continue interacting with their colleagues and to have a space where they could socialize. And then this space was somehow supported by the university itself, that set several guidelines to really build a campus, so to really build an educational space on Minecraft. So I think in that context, it became an educational space because people were there to learn, and in here learning was not only in classrooms, but also in the campus, so all these areas that are also super important for learning, where you meet your colleagues in the playground, in the outdoor spaces, and so in this example, I think it really became educational.
So just to confirm, when you say you built a campus, you're referring to in the game itself? Like there were
Yes.
okay. Just for anyone who's listening and is unfamiliar with Minecraft, it's much more of like a sandbox game. And so what is that actually like when you said you built a campus? Like how extensive are we talking when we're talking you built a campus in Minecraft? What does that look like?
Well, I can send some links or some images, but it was really like from sports centers to buildings to outside spaces. So at some moment, the Department of Geography did this report that set several guidelines so that people were using the same type of color, the same type of.
Wow.
So it was not the entire campus, but a big part of the campus. And because there were so many students interested in participating in this collective effort to
Sorry,
somehow
were there
overcome.
classes? Were there classes on in the virtual Minecraft campus? Like did you like teach in the space?
Yeah, so at some moment there was also the involvement of professors. let me see here. I don't know if I can share. I
Like, I
can
guess I'm
share
just
here in
trying
the
to
chat.
picture, is it like, a university building in a sandbox game of Minecraft that I can like walk around with and see my friends in? Or is it like I can actually go and sit and attend a lecture inside Minecraft, inside this university?
Yes.
Like, I can. That's like the level of university in Minecraft we're referring to here.
Yes. So I don't know. Can I share here in the chat?
Well, so this is being recorded for a podcast, so you can send me the links later, and I'll include them at the base of the podcast itself.
Okay.
Just
Yeah.
because
Okay.
for the listeners, right, they're not going to have the visual anyways.
Okay.
But if you want to like try to describe it, I'm just trying to get those visuals down myself. Which
Yes.
is why I'm
Yes.
asking.
So it's there are plants, there are green areas, there are the patios, there are the buildings. It's very extensive.
Wow.
And it was supported by the institution, so it became institutional. The departments supported that, and so
Wow.
yeah.
So thinking about that, I mean, you had departmental support, you had university support, and you had quite an extensive thing in there. I mean, that must have been a large project. Is it done now? Is it still going?
Yeah, so it still exists. It's a collective project, but it was more, how to say, it was more highlighted by even the office of the vice president of the arts and several, when it was the pandemic. So it was a way
Right.
to that the university also supported to find a substitute and here like a playful substitute of what a university could
Yeah.
be, much more interesting than a Zoom
Wow.
or other tools that were being used by universities to have the classes. But I don't know. It's easier to also somehow merge a Zoom tool with a kind of digital space, right? So because I studied after it happened, I was not. I didn't participated in any class. Also, I'm not registered in Stanford, right? So
Yeah. So I'm just kind of curious, like, was there pushback from the institution for making a like not from the institution, but from like certain teachers or students being like, I don't want to use this, like, or I don't know how to use this? Because I feel like trying to roll something that out on that kind of level could lead to people being like, I don't want to put my class in Minecraft. Like, was there any of that kind of language or discourse kind of happening?
that I found, no, I found overwhelming acceptance both by the institution and by the students.
Wow, I mean, that's really kudos to you. I mean, that's really awesome. That's really cool. And so,
Yes.
kind of moving on from that, I mean, in your bio for the event, I thought it was really funny and interesting that you put down global positive change as kind of like your work and how you put in education and games. And I mean, that's like a really like not loaded but heavy like big statement, right? Global positive change. So can you kind of speak to what you mean by that a little bit more and like your work and what you're doing? I mean, I think like the Minecraft stuff hints at that a little bit, but also there's probably some more there.
Yeah. So it's also with small actions that you can make change. It's not necessarily only the CIOs of the big corporations that they can, or the politicians that are in the top of the governments and go on the Davos meetings that can make change. I think everyone can make change in their daily lives. And I believe that we are in a kind of transition period. We are facing very serious climate crisis and also societal crisis that is somehow related, but has also other difficult aspects. And I think it's really important to have this kind of maybe dreamy attitude. But if we are not aiming to change the world as it is now, then the future generations will have a really difficult time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's super fair. I mean, having the mindset is super critical and important. But where do games fit into that idea of global positive change? I mean, there's so many kind of issues and challenges we could look for that could use some change. And so, for you, where do you see kind of games being a piece there?
So first, in the aspect that initially also brought me to the game design community is the types of discussions that can be made that is more exploratory and more maybe easy to experiment than. So it's easy to experiment with Minecraft than with a city, right? So it's easier to change a city in Minecraft than it is in reality a city. So in this aspect of being more exploratory and because of this, more open to change.
Yeah.
And then, and I think it's important to say is that the game industry is also multimillionaire. So there is a lot of big companies. So there's a big share of the economy related with game design. And in that way, it also has a strong impact because it influences entire generations, right? So I'm not saying that every youngster in the world is playing at some moment some game, but that is the reality, right? So it has a real impact on people. I remember when I was growing up, also the impact that game design had on me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I remember there was a report that was, I think it was 2018, and it was 99% of American teens play video games.
Yes.
Right, and so like I know that in some spaces, especially typically more developed economy countries,
Yes.
video games are quite pervasive.
Yes.
But I mean, the idea of like global kind of issues is not just kind of a developed nation issue. You know what I mean? Like they pervade kind of all these different countries, and I'm not sure if games can always reach. Just to play kind of a little bit of a devil's advocate for you here, like can games
Yes.
kind of help spaces where the video game industry isn't really able to touch, or cultures and countries that aren't always getting the representation they need in these games? Like what can games kind of do for spaces that are perhaps often ignored by the big companies that exist in the games industry?
Yeah. So I think with the internet and in a lot of nations that are not considered like developed, they have other types of development, right? And so countries in South America or Africa or Asia or everyone has a mobile phone at least. So the use of the internet and people are using all these kind of tools too. So it's not only in the Western world that kids are using digital games to learn and to have fun. I think it's all over the world. Maybe the screens can be bigger or smaller. The time of connection can be bigger or smaller because in some countries you don't have electricity all the time, for example.
Right.
But everyone has access to it, and especially it was with the internet that really made a widespread connection and that people have access to these tools. And in this aspect, it can also put together people from Africa and people from North America playing the same, like these multi-agent games that sometimes you find online, right? So this is also like a leveler that people in different societies with different socioeconomical levels, with different contexts, can be sometimes even not really knowing, can be side by side playing the same game.
Yeah.
So I think it's, yes, there is a difference in the type of devices, but I think it's not so exclusive of the South, of the North, and that in the South, people are not using this type of digital tools. I think
Yeah, no, I mean,
it's
I'm glad that
widespread.
you put it that way, because I mean, I asked you that question intentionally, kind of hoping you would get to that kind of answer of that it's not just like a global North, global South, or global like
Yes.
economy thing. Um, and I just to kind of hang on that for a bit, because I mean, I have like one or two questions left before we have the next person coming in. But that's an issue that I mean isn't just specific to educational games. And so, like, the idea of like globalized connectivity and kind of the idea of playing alongside others. And so, where does education see its role as like interjecting in the use of games globally? Like, where does the space of education sit in that global game industry?
Yeah, so
It's a
so
big
there is
question. It's a big question.
no,
I'm
no,
sorry. I'm asking you the big
it's
one.
good to ask big questions and to think big. I think that's the point also of this global change is to think big and to dream. So one of the aspects that I think is really important is, and in this sense, any kind of game is educational, is that when we are playing, we learn much faster than when we are in a serious environment. And there is scientific evidence of this. And this is also why children learn playing initially, because it's much more easy to learn by playing than to be in a serious way or over stress, copying stuff that you learn from a class and then recopying that in an exam with a sheet over stress.
I
So
hated that in school so much. I
yes,
hated it so much.
yes. So in my view, any kind of game is educational. Anytime that you are playing with a friend or any person, you are learning something with that too, in a much more fast way. And this is with scientific evidence already, than we are in a kind of more serious, let's say, professional, underquote, way.
Yeah.
So we
So
should play more in every situation.
I wholeheartedly agree. I'm a big fan of saying that you can make any game educational, but I'm going to
Yes,
continue. Well, this is my
yes,
last time I'm going to play devil's advocate for you here
yes.
and be like, I am a teacher. Let's imagine that I am still, I mean, I still have my license, but I'm not teaching right now because I'm in grad school. But let's imagine I'm a teacher with a class and all my students are playing a game like Fortnite or Valorant or I don't know, World of Warcraft, something like that. How do I need to be thinking about making that educational? Should I be turning to other tools? How do I kind of take those big titles that don't seem like a big learning space or don't seem like an educational space and use them? Should I even bother considering them?
Well, when you call it educational and when we discuss the educational aspect of any kind of play, we are making it more explicit. So it's important to touch on that aspect. But I would say it again that any kind of play is educational.
Mm-hmm. So is there a way
So
that we can activate, like use that in the classroom? Is there a way that like we can connect with those students around those educational play that they're doing on their own?
yes, so I think in any kind of situation, if you make it playful, even explaining something. So let's make it even in speaking. If we make a playful situation, is much more easily understood than if I scream or if I'm too much serious or if I try to push the other person to do something, right? So when you make a joke, for example, is much more easily understood than when you try to make a serious situation. So here it's not only, I think we are not only speaking about game design, but also like a playful attitude to life and to education that should be encouraged and that is much more effective for learning than to the traditional, more serious, in this class no one laughs because we are here to learn.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great piece. And I wanted to end the conversation there, so I'm going to pause for a second. But I also want to ask you a question that Marissa has put in the chat here, which is, what can games or game design? When can games or game design be subversive for institutions or cultures or etc.? So where's that space where games can actually be the subversive piece? And I think you're hinting at it slightly, but I think it'd be really great if you could kind of parse that out a little bit more explicitly for us here.
So because I try to be a change maker in a lot of situations. I have been hired to make change in universities, in projects, in certain situations. I think any kind of subversion is important to make change. So to make any kind of change of a system that exists, we need to subvert it somehow. So that's how change happens. So subversion to institutions and culture is needed to make those institutions and culture change. But a lot of times this subversion is not really welcome or not really well seen at the beginning, especially for people that try to keep the rules and keep the system. So I think it has the when is the context. So it really is the context where games and game design are inserted. If it is in a context inside an institution that is more exploratory, like you were speaking about the labs or exploratory labs. Maybe it's easier to explore ways of subversion than if it is on a syllabus, on a kind of more fixed educational curriculum that has to be accepted by different people in the department and different levels. And in terms of the culture too, I mean, if we test subversion in, how to say, aspects of culture that are not so money-based or so institutional or so in the structures of society itself, is more easy to subvert it than if we started playing with health or death or religion, that are aspects that are more sometimes more crucial to people and have more sometimes issues playing with that.
For sure. I mean, I also would just argue that that's like a space that's really where small games can shine, like where independent games being made can be really subversive, because like the mainstream games have a hard time doing that, but the smaller titles that get produced have a really good ability to kind of make that subversive statement, and humor in games is really effective of that. And I'm just going to plug that because this podcast will be released as part of the Humor in Games podcast, which historically has not focused on education, but focused on the role of humor in video games. And we have 2 other seasons out. And in the first one, we really do talk about kind of the subversive nature of humor in games and how it can talk about like really serious stuff around social issues, to cultural issues, to political issues. And so I think those are a few different ways that we can kind of address the question that Marissa was bringing up there. So thank you for that. I also realized that we're now technically 3 minutes over your time for the interview. So I do want to thank you for your time, Diogo. And I mean, I'll be seeing you in the panel later tonight. So thank you for that. I think the next person we have up is Effie, and Effie is here. I'm going to just take a 1-minute break to do that transfer, but thanks so much, Diego. Have a wonderful hour, I guess, until I see you again. So take care.
Thank you for this talk. I enjoyed it very much. See you later, Scott.
Okay, so I'm going to have you introduce yourself, even though I know technically it's kind of rude not to introduce you. But the idea is that this will be recorded. So first question for every podcast is, can you please introduce yourself to our wonderful audience today?
Of course, I can. Hi, everyone. My name is Effie Argyropoulos. I am a project lead at a not-for-profit organization called Digital Public Square. We're based out of Toronto, doing a lot of cool work with gamification.
I mean, so before we start into that cool work,
okay.
Who is Digital Public Square? Like, who is this nonprofit?
Who is Digital Public Square?
What are you people?
Okay, fabulous. So Digital Public Square, we actually, this is before my time, but spawned out of the Monk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto many, many years ago, kind of focusing on projects looking at sensitive environments. And over time, we have become a not-for-profit organization that looks to improve community resilience through digital means. So that can take a number of different forms, but ultimately is working with communities to make them more digitally robust and ultimately healthier, happier.
Incredible. So when we talk communities, are we talking every community? Are there specific communities? Is there like a focus here that we have in terms of demographics?
There can be. It's very project dependent. We're just a series of different projects. So it will depend very much so on the focus, but it can be something quite wide, like the project I work on that's Canada based. It can be something more niche, looking at particular communities within that. So it's hard to say in one shot, but the idea is to be able to reach a number of different people and take on techniques that might be able to reach different audiences within one intervention as well.
Very cool. And so, I mean, you're at an event about educational games, but it sounds like you guys all do more than digital games. So like how much is games part of your work and how much is games kind of adjacent to your work?
I would say games is pretty fundamentally core to our work.
Okay.
But they might be in a slightly different vein or context. We see gamification as a means of improving misinformation or addressing misinformation online.
Right.
We see so many harmful impacts of that misinformation, and we see different techniques that seek to mitigate that. But what we've found over time and through trial and testing is that gamification is a really robust means of addressing complex, sensitive topics in an online ecosystem.
And why gamification? Because gamification is different than games, right? For anyone listening, gamification is more like reward systems and leaderboards and point systems, which games have, but aren't always like the be-all and all of games. So why
Right.
gamification has been so successful?
So that's a really interesting point. So if I can explain it a little bit,
Yeah,
we've adopted a model where we see refutations as being a model for misconception revision. So we see a lot of evidence that indicates that refutations might be a good misconception revision technique.
So can you explain like refutations a bit more?
Absolutely. So when I say refutations, I mean an opportunity for somebody to indicate if something is true or false, or refuting, saying the opposite of a piece of information that is widely contended.
Right.
A good example might be that COVID vaccines or COVID in itself was created by Bill Gates.
Right.
So to refute that, so a refutation might be in opposition to that, or an opportunity to indicate otherwise.
And so you find that gamification is a really powerful tool for kind of dealing with those kind of contrarian or refutable points.
Exactly. The idea is that refutations on their own can be powerful, but when it's in an information ecosystem that's a little bit more contentious, or there's more controversy around it, we see mixed results. And so what we've done at Digital Public Square was try to understand if gamification of those refutations could have an impact on, or could have a positive impact on that interaction.
Right. And so a really powerful example of this is the game that we're showcasing here this week, right? Which is Know It or Not.
Exactly. Know It or Not is a prime example of that. In fact, we conducted a randomized controlled trial, or in other words, we wanted to test if in fact gamification did have an impact. So we have this idea of refutations. I think a really accessible example is true and false, right? Under having a statement and indicating if that's true or false. And we wanted to see if actually gamifying that information made a difference in people's ability to retain information, in people's emotional responses to the information they were being presented with. And I can certainly go into detail about it, but the long story short is that what we saw statistically significantly was that having the same information displayed in a gamified format and using a model of refutations was actually more effective at driving impact.
That's really interesting. That's really cool. The Scholar and Me, have you guys published that? Is that published?
We have published
You
that.
have published
and
that.
Dare I say, we have just conducted another randomized controlled trial. The one I was referencing had to do with a game we made all about COVID information. We've just concluded the findings of another, and so that's going to be coming out really soon, and I'm really happy to say that the findings are showing something really encouraging in that respect too.
I love that. That's so cool. So I guess for Know It or Not, because technically we haven't had this conversation yet. So would you have classified it? You classify it more as a gamification than a game?
Correct.
Okay. Because I was personally under that impression, but I was worried you were going to come in here and be like, we have this incredible game. And I was going to be like, well, it's more like a gamification system.
It's a bit of a gamification system.
Okay, very cool. And so is that your sole kind of big project that kind of shows that piece that you're talking about, refutations and kind of like pushing back? Or are there other projects that Digital Public Square is up to?
There are some other ones. I would say for a Canadian audience, that's the best example of our gamified approach. We had another one, like I said, pertaining to COVID information. This is before information around the vaccine came to the fore, and that was called It's Contagious. It's a similar style that has a little bit of a reward system embedded in that as well.
Yeah.
But
I've played that one.
You've played that one too. Okay, so you're a veteran of our tools.
I had to check it out. I mean, I studied disinformation in games. I had to check it out. Just a quick thing to the Force Space team. Apparently, the people in the Zoom can't see us, and they would like to, if possible. But it's Contagious still available to play?
It is still available to
Okay.
play. What is different is that we're not actively promoting it through different channels, and so we're not regularly monitoring or updating the links within that.
Right.
What we do with Know It or Not is make sure that all of the information and
Because it gets
content is
updated
up to date.
constantly. Because I
Constantly
reloaded it
updated.
today and I hadn't played it in a month or two, and there was already a different opening kind of question for me where I was supposed to give like a satisfaction about my booster shot.
Totally. But that's one of the benefits of it. Not only is it a model for revising misconceptions, but it's actually able to be really reactive. So as new information enters the ecosystem, we know how quickly rumors, particularly around the COVID vaccine, manifest. We're actually able to be really reactive
Yeah.
and put that information in within hours.
So, I mean, you're going to be talking about this on the panel, so I don't want to get like too into like the whole like implementation side, but you did mention that's a big part of Digital Public Square. And so have you had any kind of roadblocks or challenges of like making a game of this scale for, all of Canada? Canada's still pretty big. I mean, we're
sure.
smaller than the States, but we're still a big country, both geographically and population wise. So what kind of challenges have you had in like getting it to the communities that need it most? Because I mean, there are some people who probably need that information a little bit more than others. And what kind of challenges have you had in that?
Totally. There's probably two key challenges I can speak to. One is the idea that we know, particularly vaccine hesitancy is a spectrum. It's not a binary. And so you're going to need to meet people where they are at different points on that spectrum. So one of the things is thinking about, well, that means that people are going to need different information pending where they're at. How do we tackle that? One of the ways we've done that with Know It or Not is by developing it into what we call an adaptive product. What we mean by that is that by being asked that question about how you feel about boosters that you just brought up, it actually could send a user down a particular line of questioning in line with what we determine to be their hesitant typology, and a more accessible term for that is probably how hesitant they are.
So it sounds almost like an academic choose your own adventure game where I don't know that I'm choosing my own adventure, but I indirectly am selecting the adventure
Correct.
questions that I'm about to embark on based off my hesitancy or answers to the first
Yeah,
questions.
totally. And we can see from, in a way that we collect absolutely no personally identifiable information, but we can see from the way people down each of those streams interact, how they're effectively interacting with the information, how much it's resonating.
Okay.
So
That's so cool. That's really cool. And so how big of a team is working on a game like this, or a gamification game like this?
that's a good question. And you would think there's so many fabulous, wonderful people
You don't
that have
I
a
don't need
role
the
in
exact
this.
number. I
Digital
don't need the
Public
exact
Square, we're
number.
about 30,
Okay.
but not all of us are necessarily working on this. But I would argue that every single person in some way or form, big or small, has an impact
on it.
and has helped this project at some point. So
And it's been solely within Digital Public Square, because I know like some nonprofits or some research groups will like outreach some of their game development stuff or some of their design stuff.
So not necessarily, actually. And that brings me to kind of the second part of my response to your question a moment ago, which is the idea that how do we tackle such a broad audience through one intervention?
Yeah.
And one of the challenges we found, though we collect no personally identifiable information, we do have an optional opt-in to provide some demographic information. And what we saw were that some equity deserving communities weren't at least getting to that point, at least indicating what their demographics were. And specifically, we were seeing that in folks that were self-identifying as Indigenous or self-identifying as being part of the Black community. And through that, we undertook a series of more in-depth engagement to better understand how the intervention might be modified to better suit those communities. And I will be talking about that more in the panel, but we did do quite a bit, and quite a bit externally. We felt it was really important that organizations led by the communities we wanted to serve be at the fore of that design and information generation.
And so not to then spoil the panel, but to spoil the ending of the panel. Did it work?
TBC.
We
are so close. We are at such an interesting part that it's all coming together. I hope it will. I think a really valuable point is that there's been so much learning along the way that could be implemented in other health promotion or gamification techniques. Have we measured and evaluated it yet? Not yet. That's coming up really soon. But you've caught us at this interesting time. So
I'm very curious to see what's in store. And before we kind of round off, I feel like I want to know a little bit more about you, Effie.
Okay.
Who are you? How'd you get into
What
this
do you wanna
project?
know? Okay.
Give me that, a little bit of that
Do you want a little
Give me that
background of
personal
Effie?
identifying information.
Okay. So who am I? I have a bit of a background in public health. I think it's so fascinating, all of the different
Mhm.
determinants that impact our well-being. I worked in a public health team in London, UK for a number of years,
Okay.
doing work in different kinds of public health domains, but most recently on vaccine hesitancy.
Very cool.
Came back to my native Canada, and this role popped out and just completely ticked every box of the things I wanted to check out. So that's
Amazing.
my origin story.
So you don't have a games background at all?
Not at all.
So was it intimidating to kind of get thrown into making some kind of, gamification piece?
Was it ever? Was it ever? It was so intimidating.
So how did you go about kind of getting those skills and knowledge that you needed? I mean, we were talking earlier about kind of like, how does someone who wants to get into these places get into these places? So for you who kind of got thrown into the deep end, how did you catch up? How did you kind of get there to where you are now?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of trial and error. And I think one of the things Digital Public Square loves to say is, we love to try and we're going to fail a lot, but then we're going to get it right. And that kind of culture that's open to quote unquote failure is really a great learning opportunity. So it is not without a huge amount of learnings. Every time something just doesn't go to plan, which is very often.
Very often.
It is a active note that what a learning it is. And truly that has been the case. And it's only through that trial and error that we find solutions that work, or at the very least, we find what doesn't work.
I kind of love that for you. I mean, I was really hoping, because we're only on day 2, so I was like, we have some more time, but I was really hoping that some people start bringing up like the power of failure as like a learning motive.
Yeah.
Because I know that most people in education know that like when you get something wrong, it's a chance to like learn and jump from that. But games are constant spaces for failure, and yet I'm not seeing a lot of people talking about like the learning potential of those spaces. And even like the design skill of like making a game, it's a constant banging your head against the wall of like, why isn't my code doing what I want my code to do?
Absolutely.
So thank you for bringing that up, and thank you for being here. And I mean, I can't wait to hear more about all of what you do in the panel in about 45 minutes. So
Same.
Thank you for being here. We do have Avery is up next, and Avery is kind of walking around the space and checking things out now. So I encourage you to check out the space, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the panel later today. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks,
Amazing.
thanks. First things first, who are you? What are you doing here? Who is this person sitting across from me at the table?
I am Avery Rueb. I've been a...
I think you might have to be closer to the mic.
Closer?
You can pull the mic to you.
Oh, yeah.
If that's more comfortable. So let's restart that. Let's restart that.
let's
Who
start
are
again.
you? Who are you?
My name is Avery Rueb. I've been a teacher for over 20 years, almost probably 25 years now. And I co-founded an educational game studio about 10 years ago. We're called Affordance Studio. We have 23 employees, and we do all different types of games. We do board games, video games, and we work with clients like museums, banks, pharmaceuticals, governments, classrooms. And we have just been doing this for a really long time. So we kind of have an idea of how the market works, what works well. And we've been able to kind of grow to 23 employees in 10 years. So.
And you've been there since the beginning.
Been there since the beginning. 2014 is when I started the company. Really kind of started in 2013. So this is really our 10th year.
Wow.
Which is amazing.
Happy decade.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations.
Happy decade, exactly.
So what was the first initial idea that started Affordance Studio?
We had 2 game ideas. I work in language learning, and we had a speaking game where you had to kind of negotiate with somebody else out loud. So let's say you negotiated for a car, someone played the role of the buyer, someone played the role of the seller, and you had to talk and then agree on a final price. So that was a game that we sold into 500 schools, but it was kind of before the school internet could really handle a multiplayer game in a classroom. People didn't have devices, so people really loved the idea, but unfortunately we weren't able to really get a lot of users, but people loved the idea, and we did research on it as well. And then we were also working on a game about human resources and really taking the whole...
Not HR.
It was HR.
Oh, it was HR.
Yeah,
okay.
We did HR. And it was like a resource management game, but instead of like, running a civilization, you were running a company. And how do I make sure that there's enough employees and everyone has enough work, and what happened? Everyone's working well together.
And so these game ideas, were they targeted towards schools?
So both of them were towards schools. One was towards universities and one was towards secondary schools. And it was just the beginning, right? We didn't know really what we were doing. We made a lot of mistakes, but we were able to get them financed. We were able to get them sold in some way, shape, or form. So we realized we had some kind of like knack for this and some kind of passion and drive for it. And so then since then, we've just come kind of building blocks from that. We've made a ton of mistakes, but we've luckily gotten a few things right too.
So there's so many things I want to talk about here now.
Yes.
We only have 15 minutes for
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
podcast. So I guess as someone who's, a decade in, and you just mentioned you've learned from a lot of mistakes, what are kind of like the three big learning from those mistakes that you feel like you've really grown from? Like, what are some three kind of big learning moments that you've had in your whole process of kind of Affordance Studios?
Great question. I think the first question is that selling educational games per unit, like, okay, you've got a game, you pay me $5 for a game or $10 for a game, it's very hard to do.
Yeah.
So coming up with a better business model is important. We give a lot of our games away whenever we can. So we'll find a partner that's interested in making a game. So for instance, we're making a financial literacy game for Indigenous communities all throughout Canada. We get the funding through a partner. We build the game with them. We co-create it, and then we just give the game away. We have a board game where you actually have to pay just the cost of the printing. So it's not free, but it's not. There's no profit on it.
Yeah.
And then the video game is totally free.
Wow.
So that's number one. Number two, working with clients. Everyone kind of goes into it with like, stars in their eyes that they're going to make, I don't know what they're going to make, an MMORPG, and it's going to only cost $20,000, and
Just
it's going to have
a small
AI
amount.
and
Yeah.
VR in it, and you're probably going to play it on Mars. So how to work with a client and help guide them through the process to design their game and co-create it with them, but help them to understand what's really doable. And because we've been doing it for 10 years, we have, some credibility to kind of help people. And they also know that our ultimate goal is not to become like, super millionaires. I mean, I wouldn't mind if one of our games sold a lot.
Wouldn't hate it.
No, but it's a different business.
Yeah.
It's a business where it's mission driven, and all of our employees really love what we do, and so everyone's motivated by that. Making a lot of money, I would love, but that's not really what we want to do. And so I think the people we work with understand that. Third lesson, learning is hard. Learning is hard and really complex. I know that sounds pretty ordinary when I'm saying, but I think it's real. It's not just what they're learning, but it's also how they're learning it, what they're bringing to the table, what you really want to track afterwards if you're able to track that.
Yeah.
And games can't really solve all of that. You can't just make a game and say, okay, well, I've made a game and now someone can speak a second language. It's got to be part of the solution, and the rest of the solution, also is kind of important on, how the learning is actually, what are the learning outcomes in the end? So it's pretty complex learning.
Yeah. I mean, those are all really fantastic.
Those are
pieces of
real.
advice.
I mean, those are like, I was just thinking in my brain, I was like, really, what have we learned? And I would say those are the three biggest kind of takeaways.
And I mean, I think that like it's important to be real with people about going into the educational game industry, because I've had all these people beat to me. They're like, "Oh, you make educational games? Well, that's got to be profitable." And I'm like, I don't think you know that it's probably not that profitable of a space. But also, I mean, we were talking about kind of like games aren't the be all end all, and I totally agree. But what can games do? What is the value that games have from an educational perspective? Where do they stand for you?
Okay,
What's so great about games?
Well, one, games are like really popular, and everyone kind of likes to play games, even basic games. If you ask anyone, do you like games? Or are you a gamer? People will say, no, I'm not. Or a lot of people will say, no, I'm not a gamer, but they'll love maybe Pictionary, they'll let, whatever.
Scrabble.
Candy
Crush on their phone.
Candy Crush on their phone. Yeah. So if you make kind of casual games, most everyone's going to be somewhat interested in playing some sort of games. So you do have like the engagement level. Afterwards, you're going to be dealing with, what are the learning outcomes? So you can have some kind of like raising awareness. So I play a game and afterwards I understand an idea from maybe a different perspective, or I'm sensitized to the fact that there's other communities out there that have a different perspective on something. So, there's a lot of games where you have to take on the role of somebody else. And when you take that role on, you kind of have to become that person. So we have a game that's pretty funny. It's actually here. It's called I Thrive Sim. It's not actually meant to be funny, but there's funny parts to it. And so when you're playing the game, you have to like become a member of the American government. And some people are like, for instance, part of the Department of Economy, or the finance ministry. And when they do that, they frequently take on kind of the role a little bit more like Republican-esque, and they're saying like we got to have money, everyone's got to be, we got to open up the economy. It's during the pandemic, and so we want to have some kind of interaction with like what happened during the pandemic. And so when you kind of take that role on, you do have some kind of understanding of what maybe a Republican thinks or how they kind of work.
Yeah, no, I mean, I thought it was in the space and it's playing on like a loop, which I've checked out, and I checked out before, and it seems like a really cool kind of piece. I mean, I know that some people might be sick of the pandemic at this point, but you mentioned there's a lot of value in like the design side of games.
Yes.
There's also a lot of value in kind of how games, like the play of the game itself, and then there's also value in kind of reflecting on all of that process. And so, where is for you like the key part of that whole process? Like, where is the most learning occurring?
Well, as a company, we have to make a game. So we have to have a game that someone can play and people interact with. So when it comes to making games, it really comes down to what does the client need. So a lot of times we'll go in and they'll say we need someone to learn how to use a specific software, or we need to have someone be able to speak more readily in a second language. We do that with the government, for instance. And the overall idea is then we make that game. And then we go and we not only test the game while we design it to make sure everyone really likes it, but then we test the outcome. Did the people actually learn something? And can we prove that to the client so that they can, explain that to their bosses and what have you?
People love those deliverables. So for anyone who is in the Zoom room, we're going to be ending kind of the interview section now for the day. But we are going to have a panel here in about... what time is it? In about 20 minutes, we're going to have a panel here. It's going to be how do we implement games? How do we facilitate games? How do we get them into those spaces? And so I urge you to tune in if you are interested and would like to check it out. Otherwise, I'll be back here tomorrow, I think 1:30, 1:45. It's online, so don't trust me right now while I'm not able to look at the calendar. I would say 1:45 for another set of interviews with some other incredible people who are both designers, devs, or anything in between. And so have a wonderful rest of your day. Hope to see you at the panel later. Drink water, stretch your bodies, live life. Talk to you later. Thanks so much.